Welcome to episode 21 of the Monday American. This is your host, Andrew, and since I have done a couple of episodes in a row with some pretty awkward, not really entertaining intros, I decided to go ahead and give it one more whirl, and maybe it'll be the last time I do that. All I wanted to do is bring to your attention that I couldn't be more grateful and more appreciative and more humble to announce that we are the one of the finalists in the 2017 podcast awards put on by discoverpods.com. They wrote a feature about the Monday American in our early days about a year ago, but basically how it works is the nominations get made. People start voting by just submitting and nominating, and then the finalists are announced. They were announced on the December 1st. And you can vote for those finalists, that, you know, the top of the nominees, until December 15th. And we have been nominated as finalists for 2 different categories. I just wanted to say that I'm blown away, truly, truly blown away to be on those lists with some of the podcasts on there, some of the biggest names in podcasting. It's pretty incredible, and I'll never be able to not be overcome and overwhelmed by how amazing this is. So if you want to vote, I think the easiest way is to go to theMondayAmerican.com, click on the banner on the top. It will take you directly to the Google link, the Google Documents link, where you can fill out the vote. All you need is an email. They don't keep it or anything. They just need it to make sure everyone is doing 1 vote per person. And then you can go find the Monday American for the People's Choice Award and for the best podcast and news. Just blown away, absolutely blown away. So here's episode 21. It is Made in America, which features Theodore Roosevelt Jr.
You're listening to The Monday American, the show that puts the story back into history. Making history come alive, one episode at a time. The show made for the people, by the people. Visit theMondayAmerican.com to get more. Dive into the Monday American. Don't worry, we'll be gentle.
I wish that I could tell you that I've got a killer episode ahead for you, but at this point, I've sat down maybe 5 or 6 times to record, and nothing is coming to me that I am happy with, and I've had to scrap a ton of episodes, and I'm at the point right now where it's kind of been a while since I've done a history episode for a history podcast. So I say that to really just clear out my own mind and my own thoughts, but what this episode is supposed to be a focus on a person in our country's history that is so important that without them, we'd be living in a different world today. And it always makes me wonder, what do you think you would have to do, or me myself, in order to be included just in a history book in 100 years from now, let alone make decisions that have a direct positive impact on the world we live in today? And Theodore Roosevelt was a man who didn't just make it into the history books. He altered the course of the world and the nation in order to be where we are today. Now, some people will argue that that's not exactly a good thing, because a lot of people are unhappy with where we are today. But my focus on this is that Theodore Roosevelt, he made changes, or he made decisions that positively affected the future of the country. So, not necessarily he's responsible for everything that happened today, but without him, the country would be different, so far different than where we are today, and not in a good way. Let's back up a little bit, because as the show's slogan states, we put the story back into history. And with all this stuff going on today, and with all the interviews I've done and am doing for the future, and with all the podcast award stuff, I want to make sure that I do not forget the spirit of this show, and that is to put the story back into history. So let's start with when our 26th president, Theodore Roosevelt, was born. Theodore Roosevelt was born on October 27, 1858, and he grew up in New York City. He was the second of 4 children, and his dad was a well-to-do businessman and philanthropist. His mother was a Southerner raised on a plantation in Georgia. He grew up just surrounded by the love of his parents and siblings, but he was a very sickly child affected with asthma, and I mean really, really bad asthma. And as a teenager, he decided that he would, quote, make his body, and he undertook a program of gymnastics and weightlifting, which helped him develop a rugged physique. Now, think for a second the time that he was born. He was born in 1858. This is just a year or two before the Civil War. And he was one of the first men that I can think of in this day and age. And remember, this is a time where if you got shot, you were probably going to die. As stupid as that sounds, think about it in the way that if you're in the Civil War and you get shot in a non-lethal wound, most of those guys ended up dying or having some of the worst painful procedures in order to fix whatever was going on, and most of them then would die from complications of that wound or that surgery. So remember that this is a day and age where people didn't have as much of a feeling of control over their own destiny or over their own life as we do today. And I think that's something we don't really consider very often, is that when you go to the doctor and he tells you what you have, or if you're sick with something, or if you come down with, most things other than cancer are pretty curable. And this was a day and age where things happened to you. You didn't happen to life. You didn't choose life. You didn't control life. Life kind of happened to you. And that's not to say that these people were pushovers. It was just the technology of the time and the day and age that these people lived in. They just didn't have many options. And Theodore Roosevelt, I say he's the first. He probably wasn't the first, but he's the first man in our history that I can think of that just basically took the circumstances life gave him and said, no, thank you, I'll make my own. Now, that's the first thing that I think is the most impressive about him, is that he decided to change what he wanted changed, and then he did it. And in this day and age, that's very, very uncommon. Now, he was very sick. He had asthma. He would make his body. He did the gymnastics, weightlifting, and he became a lifelong advocate of exercise and the, quote, strenuous life. He always found time for physical activities, including hiking. He was a very talented horseback rider and swimming. He was tutored as a young boy at home by private teachers, and he traveled extensively through Europe and the Middle East with his family during the late 1860s and early 1870s. He actually lived with a host family in Germany for 5 months as well. And in 1876, he entered Harvard College, where he studied a variety of subjects, including German, natural history, zoology, forensics, and composition. He continued his physical endeavors and began boxing and wrestling as his new pursuits. During college, he fell in love with Alice Hathaway Lee. She was a young woman from a prominent New England banking family that he met through a friend at Harvard, and they were married in October of 1880. Then he enrolled in Columbia Law School. He dropped out 1 year after law school to begin a career in public service, and this is where the Theodore Roosevelt that we know really was born, because his public service is a shining example of what public servants should be today. Yes, the man had his flaws, but he overall was someone that improved the nation. And the author Robert W. Mary has a book titled President McKinley, in which he states that Theodore Roosevelt, quote, perceived and promoted the American ascendancy long before events brought it into focus for others. And I think that's the foundation of why Theodore Roosevelt was such an important president to our country, is because long before people or events could be a catalyst to people thinking that the ascendancy of the American nation was on the rise, Roosevelt was already actively trying to help that come to fruition. And one of the things that I think is just so impressive about Theodore Roosevelt is that he was a man who experienced pain and experienced tragedy that nearly kept him from becoming the man that we all know today. But there's no success story that involves no failure. I mean, failure is what brings ultimate success later on. You learn, like, maybe that's not the best way to say it. Maybe it's success is meaningless without failure, because if you don't have failure, then you don't know. It kind of puts into perspective just how good success is. But it also really reminds us that some people never do achieve success. All they experience is failure in life, and it's really what they make with those circumstances. When he was elected to the New York Assembly, he served 2 terms from 1882 to 1884. And in 1884, he nearly left politics forever. He was struck with a double tragedy. On February 12th, Alice, his wife, gave birth to a daughter. 2 days later, Roosevelt's mother died of typhoid fever, and his wife died of kidney disease within a few hours of each other and in the same house. For the next couple months, he was devastated. He threw himself into political work to escape his grief, and finally, he left his daughter in the care of his sister, and he fled to the Dakota Badlands. This is where he became the man that we know today. He went to the Badlands. He fell in love with that cowboy culture, and he tried to become a cowboy himself, and he would later kind of shape himself into the man and have this persona of what a man should be in his eyes. And even though a lot of it is a little bit over the top, it still today is widely regarded as the most positive character traits a man can have. And that's what Roosevelt embodied. And he really learned how to be this better version of himself out in the Dakota Badlands. And since I am by far not anywhere qualified to be the man who tells you what he thought and what kind of attitude he had on failures and what he learned about his time in the Badlands, we should just go to the source himself, Theodore Roosevelt. This is an excerpt from a speech called Citizenship in a Republic that he delivered at the Sorbonne in Paris, France on April 23rd, 1910. And I think it is one of the best quotes you'll hear about success and failure. But in this speech he said, quote, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." And I think if I had just said that earlier when I was talking about success and failure, I think that would have been probably the best I could have done. But he's a man who is much better than I. And those words really tell you about the type of man he was and the type of man he thought other men should be. Eventually, Roosevelt did resume his political career, and obviously he did. He was our president, but he returned to New York. And he resumed his career by unsuccessfully running for the mayor of New York City in 1886. Again, the failure that brings the later success. In 1888, he campaigned for the Republican presidential nominee Benjamin Harrison. And when Harrison won the election, he appointed Roosevelt to the United States Civil Service Commission. He was reappointed to that commission by Democratic President Grover Cleveland in 1893. It says a lot about a person to be appointed to a cabinet position by opposing parties. It means that you are really doing a good job. And that's one of the things I think, that's probably the reason I admire, and so many others do, Theodore Roosevelt so much, is he was doing the jobs he was in the correct way. As the commissioner, he worked hard to enforce the civil service laws, although he regularly clashed with party regulars and politicians who wanted him to ignore the law in favor of patronage, which is all too common today. He served dutifully as the commissioner until he accepted the presidency of the New York City Police Board, and again he clashed with a lot of locals because they would prefer him to ignore the laws in favor of a little bit of corruption. He's well known for cleaning up the party boss era in New York City, or not entirely, but cleaning them up a lot, and well known for just tamping down corruption. And that is so hard to do. I don't know if that can be done again. Think about where we are today and think about how difficult that would be. It's essentially where he was then. It's on a level that hasn't really changed. Politics have been corrupt for a long time, but he brought it down, and he brought it down to where we are today. And think of how bad it is today and how hard that would have been. And in 1897, his political career really took off. It was a result of his steadfastness to do the right thing and to be a man of character. And President William McKinley took notice of young Roosevelt, and he appointed him the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Roosevelt had long been a believer in the importance of the Navy. In 1882, he published a book called The Naval War of 1812. And I think he was actually an author of like somewhere around 50 other books, and all of them were very, very good. So this man was a very well-balanced man, but to say that he believed in the strength of the Navy is an understatement, actually. He knew that a Navy was the key to a nation propelling itself to ascendancy in a world that was changing at a speed that we still today do not understand how fast the world was changing. In the early 1900s, this was the technology, the pace of technology and the way it was improving all through World War I was at a rate that we still have no way to comprehend, because everything was changing. And when it seemed like the brand new thing was out, and it seemed like an hour later it was already obsolete. And that's the world that he lived in. But he always understood that the Navy was the way to propel a country to ascendancy. And it was at this post of Assistant Secretary of the Navy that young Theodore Roosevelt really learned, let's say, quite a bit of lessons. He was maybe too much of that man who took charge of his own circumstances, but it's where he learned to hone that in to a healthy balance. The secretary, basically the guy he was under, was John Long. He was very sound of judgment, and he was also slowed a bit by infirmities, as it's put in President McKinley, the biography. And in the administration's early months, he still needed occasional days off to preserve his stamina, but he never left his post without fears of, quote, what his impulsive assistant secretary Theodore Roosevelt would do in his absence. And he wrote, quote, he is so enthusiastic and loyal that he is in certain respects invaluable, yet I lack confidence in his good judgment and discretion. And even McKinley, he developed a fondness for the voluble Roosevelt and his often amusing pronunciations on matters that were large and small. Among the president's frequent guests for his afternoon buggy rides around Washington was Theodore Roosevelt. And that says a lot when you're just the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. That's a fairly, I don't know if that even exists anymore. I'm sure it does, but I don't know if it's called something different. But it's a fairly mid to low level role in the government, and he was riding around with the president. So it really speaks a ton to Roosevelt's ability to learn from McKinley, but also to learn from himself and see where he needed to improve. And one of the reasons that Roosevelt's boss at the time had those concerns about his irrationality of times was probably one of the funniest stories of Roosevelt's political career. And he basically decided to take things into his own hands. On September 27th, when he was the Assistant Secretary to the Navy, he intercepted a letter from his boss to Senator Chandler, touting Commodore John Adams Howell for Asiatic command. Roosevelt thought, bad idea, and he considered Dewey a far better choice. Now, the reason that Roosevelt got this letter when no one else did is because they were out of town. All his bosses were out of town. And Roosevelt considered him unequal to the assignment, particularly if the U.S. went to war, in which it was seeming like they were going to do so with Spain. We'll get there. Roosevelt readily conceded Howell's, quote, great inventive capacity, but characterized him as, quote, irresolute and extremely afraid of responsibility. And those were two characteristics Roosevelt considered particularly odious. He hoped his well-known expansionism would carry the weight with Chandler, himself a leading Senate expansionist, and it didn't work. When Chandler rebuffed Roosevelt's entreaty, the assistant secretary summoned Dewey to his office, motioned him to a chair, handed him a cigar, and lit it. Do you know any senators? He asked. The Commodore said he had a longtime family connection to Redfield Proctor from his home state of Vermont, and that was ideal. In addition to his cordial friendship with McKinley, Proctor was a rich businessman, and he had plenty of influence throughout the Republican Party and within the administration. Chandler had joined the congressional push to hasten a war with Spain over President McKinley's objections. Proctor always honored his friendship with McKinley, even in delivering his eloquent and influential report to the Senate on the depredations that he had witnessed in Cuba. He took care to avoid any expressions that could possibly unsettle the president. When Dewey approached Proctor, the senator seemed, quote, delighted to help and promptly called at the White House to put the case before McKinley, who had already been entreated by Roosevelt on the same matter. So you can see where he is able to kind of manipulate things to his own will, both for good and bad. And the president nodded his assent and promised to press the matter right away with Long. And the commander-in-chief complied, writing in pencil, Long, appoint Dewey command Asiatic Squadron. And that was it. Roosevelt had selected his officer as the best man for Asia. He demonstrated distinctive gallantry as a young Civil War officer under the command of the legendary David Farragut, and then settled into a fairly unremarkable career that interspersed various shipboard and overseas duties within the intermittent Washington assignments. In 1889, after 8 years at sea, he returned to Washington for a series of increasingly important desk jobs, culminating in his rank of Commodore and the presidency of the Board of Inspection and Survey. He was responsible for inspecting and improving all new warships. And it was in this capacity that Dewey really learned a great deal about the Navy's latest technology. And it was for all these reasons, for Roosevelt's own thinkings as well, that he decided that he would be the best man for the job, and he found a way to do it. So I say it's a funny story from his story, but it shows his ability to hasten to a decision he probably shouldn't make. And later he learned how to think things through more clearly, we'll say. Now, even though he did it in a way that was probably not the best way to do it, he eventually put the man in that position that responded correctly. And basically what happened is, because Theodore Roosevelt, he kind of made his name on the scene during the Spanish-American War. And when the battleship Maine, the U.S. battleship Maine, exploded in the Havana Harbor in 1898, he responded by putting the Navy on full alert. And he instructed Commodore George Dewey to make ready for war with Spain by taking the necessary steps to bottle up the Spanish squadron in Asian waters. And he asked Dewey to prepare for the probable invasion of the Philippines. And it turns out that he made all the right choices in that move, and it ended up being something that, although it started out with a little bit of behind-the-scenes deal-making, we'll say, he took the steps to make sure America was prepared for what was going to be coming. Now, the president at the time was William McKinley, and the Spanish-American War was something that was kind of a split issue. A lot of people wanted it, a lot of people didn't. McKinley was trying to find every solution possible to avoid war, which is what a good president should do. When the U.S. battleship Maine exploded in the Havana Harbor, it was every warmonger's dream, really. There was no way it didn't look like Spain had done it. And even though McKinley was being very cautious, and he said the right things. The public doubted it, and they were clamoring for war. And even Roosevelt, he wrote to a friend, quote, "Being a jingo, I would give anything if President McKinley would order the fleet to Havana tomorrow." He privately attributed the disaster to, quote, "an act of dirty treachery on part of the Spaniards." And this is, if you can remember back to your high school history, part of yellow journalism and how the Spanish-American War was really kind of instigated a little bit by inflammatory headlines and ironically fake news. The all of New York's influential newspapers, but in particular William Randolph Hearst's The Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's World, embraced the same view as Roosevelt. When he was told by his night editor that the main explosion would make page one, along with, quote, other big news, Hearst shot back, quote, "There is not any other big news. Please spread story all over the page." Soon Hearst and Pulitzer were competing to determine whose paper could be more bellicose and sell more papers in the process. On the evening of February 17th, the Journal emblazoned a headline across its front page that read, quote, "War, sure. Maine destroyed by Spanish. This proved absolutely by discovery of the torpedo hole," when in reality there was no such discovery, but that really didn't matter very much to William Randolph Hearst. When the Spanish-American War began, Roosevelt resigned as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy and volunteered for service as commander of the 1st United States Voluntary Cavalry, a unit known as the Rough Riders. It was an elite unit comprised of Ivy League gentlemen, Western cowboys, sheriffs, prospectors, police officers, and Native Americans. And that was really where Roosevelt kind of shaped himself. I mean, that's one of the most famous stories about Theodore Roosevelt is everyone can, if you do word association, Rough Riders, the first thing you think of is Theodore Roosevelt. And usually when you say Theodore Roosevelt, Rough Riders is what most people remember from their history classes. And that's not because it's the coolest or only good thing he did in his career. It's because it's an iconic story about the man of Theodore Roosevelt. And the reason that people remember him with Rough Riders and vice versa is because it's a unique story in our country's history. I mean, usually you're going to see politicians sending off people to war, and that's not exactly the case, but not to dive into that. This is one of the very few examples you can find where a politician felt duty to his country, and this longing for adventure was also part of it, but he wanted to serve his country, and he felt very strongly about it, so he did something about it. He led his own unit. He commissioned it himself. And although Roosevelt comes across as this rough and tumble, disorganized, knee-jerk reaction kind of a person, he was incredibly organized. He received so much praise for the preparation of the Navy for the war that he's long gone down as one of the best naval secretaries in history. He wrote to a friend from his transport ship looking onto the shore of the disorganization of everything in Cuba by saying, quote, "The interminable delays and the vacillation and utter absence of efficient organization are really discouraging." What they found also before this, when he brought his Rough Riders in from a 4-day ride into Texas, he wrote into his diary, quote, "A perfect welter of confusion, an almost inextricable tangle." I mean, his troops were forced to buy food from local shops with their own money, as commissary operations had been overwhelmed by the numbers of arriving troops. Up to 5 regiments a day were arriving, and it just was not organized. And a lot of people looked back at his preparation of the Navy during this affair and said if the Army had even half as much preparation, none of this would have happened. A lot of that just goes to show you how organized he was and how thoughtful he was, and how much he admired that in other people as well. It was one of those qualities that he just thought a man should possess. And speaking of those qualities, one of the qualities that he held most dearly was the sense for adventure, and that was shown clearly on the assault for San Juan Hill, which, aside from the story, is where Theodore Roosevelt became the only person the only president to receive a Medal of Honor citation. So he got it posthumously, but he is to this day the only president with the Medal of Honor, which really should speak volumes to the man that he was. The Americans began an artillery attack on the heights of San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill at 8 a.m. as infantry and unmounted cavalry soldiers pressed forward for the ground assault. Now, the road leading to the battle area filled up really quickly with soldiers, the American soldiers caught in kind of an ominous situation. From the tallest peaks of the heights, which were San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill, came withering enemy fire, and the exposed U.S. advance force was frozen in place by more soldiers pressing forward from the rear. Richard Harding Davis from the New York Herald wrote about it and, quote, "The situation was desperate. Our troops could not retreat. There was only one thing they could do: go forward and take the San Juan Hills by assault." When Roosevelt's Rough Riders, who were anchoring the right flank of the American line, received orders to attack at about 1 p.m., the impetuous New Yorker leaped upon his horse, which was named Little Texas, and rode back and forth among his men, exhorting them to push forward through the barrage of enemy fire raining down upon them. Soon his little regiment was so far ahead of the rest of the attack force that Davis, watching from a distance, concluded that, quote, "someone had made an awful and terrible mistake." A foreign military observer called the assault very gallant but very foolish. But the Rough Riders kept going, and soon other units joined up and charged with them. Enemy defenders quickly began to abandon both hills, and by 2 p.m., the Americans commanded the San Juan Heights, looking down upon Santiago de Cuba, with Davis poised to capture in prose the Rough Rider charge in all of its foolhardy glory. And this is where Roosevelt will become one of the country's leading military heroes, a man that beguiled the imagination of a galvanized nation. His time in the military is something that Roosevelt would personally revel in, and he later wrote about his charge in the San Juan Hill by saying, quote, "I would rather have led that charge and earned my colonelcy than served 3 terms in the U.S. Senate. It makes me feel as though I could now leave something to my children which will serve as an apology for my having existed." Roosevelt returned home a war hero. And as I mentioned earlier, he was a hero deserving of the Medal of Honor. And his citation reads as so, quote, "Medal of Honor citation, Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt. Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt distinguished himself by acts of bravery on the 1st of July of 1898 near Santiago de Cuba, Republic of Cuba, while leading a daring charge up San Juan Hill. Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt, in total disregard for his personal safety and accompanied by only 4 or 5 men, led a desperate and gallant charge up San Juan Hill, encouraging his troops to continue the assault through withering enemy fire over open countryside. Facing the enemy's heavy fire, he displayed extraordinary bravery throughout the charge and was the first to reach the enemy trenches, where he quickly killed one of the enemy with his pistol, allowing his men to continue the assault. His leadership and valor turned the tide in the battle for San Juan Hill. Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt's extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army." His feats of heroism in the war drew the attention when he came back to New York as a war hero from the Republican leaders in that state who were looking for a gubernatorial candidate. Sorry, big words are hard for me to say sometimes. He agreed to run for governor against a popular Democrat named Judge Augustus Van Wyck, and Roosevelt carried the election by just a few thousand votes. His victory stemmed largely from the work of the state's Republican Party boss, Thomas C. Platt, who threw the full support of his political machine behind the hero of San Juan Hill. Although Platt and Roosevelt had agreed to consult each other on matters, Governor Roosevelt was his own man. He supported a bill for the taxation of the value and assets of public services, such as gas, water, electric, stuff like that. His actions led to an explosive break with Platt. Almost overnight, the insurance companies, construction contractors, and privately owned public service corporations realized that all the money they were contributing to Platt's political machine brought them little, if any, influence with Governor Roosevelt. Now, Boss Platt knew that something had to be done with the governor before he completely destroyed the Republican state machine as he saw it. Consulting with the top Republican political boss in the nation, Platt conspired to, quote, kick upstairs Governor Roosevelt to the vice presidency in 1900, and that would keep Roosevelt running for a second term in New York. And also, it was just a way to get him out of power. The vice presidency was such a weak position at that point. No one really wanted to do it, and Roosevelt reluctantly agreed, and he was persuaded that that position might lead to a shot at the White House in 1904. And he also knew that the party bosses had rigged the convention, making it nearly impossible for him to avoid being nominated. And back in this day, the primaries worked, I guess it's not even really a primary yet, but it worked a little bit differently, where today the main candidate will choose their running mate usually. And there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff there. But in this day and age, they would have a nomination for the party's vice president candidate. It was pretty much out of say of the president at that time. Like, McKinley had to actually wait and see who his running mate would be for the next election. And on June 11th, Republican leaders began assembling in Philadelphia for a political convention that would be heavy on ceremony and light on drama. The city sparkled, and the only question of intrigue was the vice presidential selection, and even that didn't even seem to generate much emotion. Bliss remained a favorite of many, and attention now focused also on Iowa's William Allison. He was a Senate graybeard and financial expert who had served in the chamber for 28 years, and in the House for 8 years before that. A convention subcommittee seeking to diminish disruptive maneuverings issued a statement on either Mr. Allison or Mr. Bliss would be satisfactory to the president, and his wishes alone, and not the ambitions of the several other notables who have been prominently mentioned for the office, are now being consulted by the leaders. But the president refused to name his own choice. And on June 13th, reporters accosted Hanna about reports that the president would soon announce his favored vice presidential candidate. Quote, "There is no truth in that report whatsoever." The fact of the matter was that Hanna had come to Philadelphia with two overarching aims. The first was to get Bliss to accept the nomination, and barring that, to prevent Roosevelt from getting it. Although Bliss had declined the honor repeatedly in conversations with Hanna and others, the senator continued to work with him in Philadelphia. The only man who could galvanize the convention was the Rough Rider, who, according to the reports and inexplicably arrived in Philadelphia wearing a hat reminiscent of his Cuban adventure. When he entered the Walton Hotel's crowded lobby at 2 o'clock on June 16th, it caused an instant stir. Quote, "Here comes Teddy," a man shouted, and the crowd rushed to him with chants of "Teddy, Teddy, Teddy." When the air was filled with a chorus of "There'll be a hot time in the old town tonight," according to one journalist, quote, "Roosevelt blushed, doffed his hat, and bowed his acknowledgments as he recognized the tune played after his charge up San Juan Hill. Similar scenes emerged through the afternoon. One political commentator, noting the hat, said slyly, quote, "Gentlemen, that's an acceptance hat." Platt, who was employing his most devious cunning in efforts to ignite a Teddy Roosevelt firestorm without getting his fingers burnt, observed with quiet satisfaction that the governor was, quote, "in a state of rare excitement even for him." And even as excited as Roosevelt was, nobody could resist this phenomenon of political energy. Roosevelt couldn't, McKinley, not even Hanna. As the Associated Press put it, quote, "The town was Roosevelt mad." And Hanna was really the last to accept the inevitable. Although Roosevelt had assured the senator he wasn't a candidate, he continued his flirtatious ways. On that Sunday, before the start of the proceedings, Charles Dick saw disaster looming. The Roosevelt wave was becoming irresistible, and yet Hanna seemed bent on resisting it. And that could embarrass the president, who was following the events from far off. Charles Dick called Cortelyou at the White House to explain the deteriorating situation. He had the president at his side, and he said, quote, "The Roosevelt boom has let loose, and it has swept everything. The feeling is that the thing is going to pell-mell like a tidal wave. Although Roosevelt had opposed the wave initially, he now seemed beguiled by it, and he suggests that the president should talk to Hanna and flag him off his anti-Roosevelt machinations. Quote, "We cannot afford to have it said that something was done in spite of ourselves," said the longtime McKinley loyalist. At midnight, the president dictated a policy statement and had Cortelyou read it to Dick and other convention officials, which read, quote, "The president has no choice for vice president. Any of the distinguished names suggested would be satisfactory of him. The choice of the convention will be his choice, and he has no advice to give. The convention is the lawfully constituted body to make nominations, and instead of giving advice, he awaits its advice, confident now, as always, that it will act wisely and for the highest interest of the country and the party." And after that statement, it was pretty much settled. And to no one's surprise, Roosevelt got the nomination to the vice president to McKinley's campaign. Now that the nomination was secure, Roosevelt campaigned furiously for the Republican presidential candidate, William McKinley. Roosevelt traveled more than 21,000 miles on a special campaign train, making hundreds of speeches, and more than 3 million people saw him in person. Now, today that doesn't sound incredibly impressive. Back then, that was unheard of, absolutely unheard of. He spoke in 567 cities in 24 states. Mr. Dooley, who was a press columnist, used an exaggerated Irish accent to make political observations, wrote, "'Tis Titty alone that's running, and he ain't a-running, he's a-gallopin'." The Republican ticket overwhelmed the Democrats, racking up an 861,757 vote plurality, the largest Republican victory in years. McKinley won the popular vote of 7.2 million to Bryan's 6.3 million. McKinley won his bid for re-election over Bryan by an even larger margin than he had garnered in 1896. However, in September of 1901, the world was about to change. As President McKinley enjoyed his summer interlude at Canton, this is Polish and it looks nearly impossible to pronounce, but I'm going to do my best. Leon Solgaz, he's definitely not alive, and he's a murderer, so I don't really care how I pronounce it. He made plans to travel to Buffalo to kill the president during his visit to the Pan American Exposition. He was born in Detroit 28 years before. He was the son of Polish immigrants. He was educated in the Detroit public schools and then traveled to Cleveland to pursue factory jobs. He hung out in a working-class saloon called Dreyer's on 3rd Avenue in Todd, ate his meals there, slept intermittently in his chair, read the newspapers, kept to himself. Slight of build and sallow of skin, with a bland face accentuated by pale blue eyes, he struck others at the pub as bitter and jittery. Quote, "I never had much luck at anything," he would recall, end quote, "and this preyed upon me. It made me morose and envious." He fell in with a group of anarchists. Then he went to hear a lecture by Emma Goldman, the well-known and brutal-minded writer, thinker, and lecturer, dubbed by Murat Halstead as the Queen of Anarchy, advocate of the assassination of all rulers everywhere. "She set me on fire," recalled Solgaz. I just suck at that pronunciation. Quote, "Miss Goldman's words went right through me, and when I left the lecture, I had made up my mind that I would have to do something heroic for the cause I loved." In Buffalo, he studied the exposition grounds carefully and pursued his deadly purpose methodically. He attended the president's big trade speech at the Esplanade and sought to get close to him, but a big police guard stepped in front of him, cooling his ardor for the kill. Afterwards, he moved towards the president's departing carriage, but was herded back with the rest of the crowd. He showed up at the next few subsequent presidential events, but he couldn't ever get close enough, and he finally concluded that his best chance would be the president's reception at 4 o'clock the next afternoon. He went to the Temple of Music well before McKinley's scheduled arrival. He positioned himself near where the president would stand for the receiving line, and when McKinley entered through a side door, he pushed toward the front. In his right hand, he held a .32 caliber pistol, wrapped in a handkerchief and pressed against his chest to simulate an injury. When a small girl, led by her father, was presented to the president, McKinley leaned down and shook her hand, then guided her on to the right, smiling and waving after her. Next in line was a short, dark, mustachioed man who displayed a look of possible menace. Though he drew the attention of Secret Service agents, he passed by the president cordially. Then came Solgaz, As the president thoughtfully reached for his unbandaged left hand to shake it, the anarchist pressed his revolver against the president's chest and fired twice. At the first shot, McKinley gasped and moved back upon his toes, positioning himself to take the second round to the abdomen just below the navel. He reeled backward into the arms of Detective John Geary. Quote, "Am I shot?" asked the president in a steady voice. Geary unbuttoned McKinley's vest, saw blood, and replied, quote, "I fear you are, Mr. President." The United States of America lost President McKinley 2 days later at 2:15 on the morning of September 14th, 1901. As the nation mourned the loss of its leader and grappled with the third presidential murder in just 36 years, young Theodore Roosevelt took hold of the government with unbridled self-assurance. He promptly issued what one biographer called, quote, "a solemn pledge to be one in purpose with his predecessor." Roosevelt became the youngest person to assume office. Now, the youngest person to be elected to office was JFK, but a fun trivia question is that Roosevelt was the youngest president, and everyone gets that wrong, so that's a freebie for all of you. And as the new president, one of his first statements was, quote, "I wish to state that I shall continue absolutely unbroken the policy of President McKinley for the peace, prosperity, and the honor of the country. I am the president," he declared to a group of reporters on his first day in the White House, "and shall act in every word and deed precisely as if I, and not McKinley, had been the candidate for whom the electors cast the vote for president." It was a remarkable public utterance issued as the nation struggled with its loss as the fallen president's body was en route to Washington. But it was a unique way to look at things. He was not there to be someone he wasn't. And he thought very clearly that it was his time to lead the nation. And truly, I don't see anything wrong with that. When you vote for president, you are also voting for the vice president to potentially lead the nation. So I think that although he said it in a fairly harsh way, and maybe it was a bit of a too soon situation as the body was barely even cold of McKinley, but I think it made sense. And I think that was part of, that is where he turned the mark. Obviously, president, you pretty much are turning a mark in your life when you become president, but that's where he really kind of took reins of the nation and made the changes to make the country better. Roosevelt inherited an empire in the making when he assumed office in 1901. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, Spain had ceded the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the United States. In addition, the U.S. had established a protectorate over Cuba and annexed Hawaii. So for the first time in its fairly young history at that time, the United States had acquired an overseas empire. As president, Roosevelt wanted to increase the influence and prestige of the United States on the world stage and make the country a global power. He also believed that the exportation of American values and ideals would have an ennobling effect on the world. His diplomatic maxim was, quote, "speak softly and carry a big stick," and he maintained that a chief executive must be willing to use force when necessary while practicing the art of persuasion. He therefore sought to assemble a powerful and reliable defense for the United States to avoid conflicts with enemies who might prey on weakness. He followed McKinley in ending the relative isolationism that had dominated the country since the mid-1800s, acting aggressively in foreign affairs, often with or without the support or consent of Congress. That is one of his negative flaws. I think the Constitution is very important for many reasons, and no man is above that. One of the situations that Roosevelt inherited upon taking office was governance of the Philippines. It was a small island nation in Asia. During the Spanish-American War, the U.S. had taken control of the archipelago from Spain. When Roosevelt appointed William Howard Taft as the first civilian governor of the islands in 1901, Taft recommended the creation of a civil government with an elected legislative assembly. The Taft administration was able to negotiate with Congress for a bill that included a governor general, an independent judiciary, and the legislative assembly. So there's your exportation of American values right there for you. Now, among many other policies that he initiated in this foreign policy period, the most spectacular of them all was the establishment of the Panama Canal. For years, United States naval leaders had dreamed of building a passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through Central America. During the war with Spain, American ships in the Pacific had to go around the tip of South America, and it took a 2-month voyage to join the U.S. fleet off the coast of Cuba. In 1901, the U.S. negotiated with Britain for the support of an American-controlled canal that would be constructed either in Nicaragua or through a strip of land in Panama at that time that was owned by Colombia. In a flourish of closed-door maneuvers, the Senate approved a route through Panama, contingent upon Colombian approval, of course. When Colombia balked at the terms of the agreement, the U.S. supported a Panamanian revolution with money and a naval blockade, the latter of which prevented Colombian troops from landing in Panama. And in 1903, the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty with Panama gave the U.S. perpetual control of the canal for a price of $10 million and an annual payment of $250,000. Now, to say the least, that usage of the canal has paid over itself a million times over. Theodore Roosevelt visited Panama in 1906 to observe the building of the canal. He became the first U.S. president to leave the country during his term of office. He wanted to see the spectacle. It became known as one of the world's greatest engineering feats. Nearly 30,000 workers labored 10-hour days for 10 years to build the $400 million canal, during which time American officials were able to counteract the scourge of yellow fever that had ravaged large numbers of canal workers. The Panama Canal was finally completed in 1914, and by 1925, more than 5,000 merchant ships had traversed the 40 miles of locks every year. Once operational, it shortened the voyage from San Francisco to New York by more than 8,000 miles. Now, during the process of building this canal, it advanced the United States in a large way through technology and engineering skills. It also converted the Panama Canal Zone into a major staging area for American military forces, making the U.S. a dominant military power in Central America. Latin America consumed a fair amount of Roosevelt's time and energy during his first term as president. Venezuela became a focus of his attention in 1902. Germany and Britain had sent ships to blockade the country's coastline. The European nations had given loans to Venezuela that the Venezuelan dictator refused to pay. Although Germany and Britain assured the Americans that they did not have any territorial designs on Venezuela, Roosevelt felt aggrieved by their actions and demanded that they agree to arbitration to resolve the dispute. Santo Domingo, which is now called the Dominican Republic, also encountered problems with European countries. Again, European investors had appealed to their governments to collect money from a debt-ridden nation, Latin American nation. After the Dominican government appealed to the U.S., Roosevelt ordered an American collector to assume control of the customs houses and collect duties to avoid possible European military action. It became known as the Santo Domingo Crisis, and Roosevelt formulated what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, which was issued in 1823, stated that the U.S. would not accept European intervention in the Americas. Roosevelt realized that if nations in the Western Hemisphere continued to have chronic problems, such as the inability to repay foreign debt, they would become targets of European invention. To preempt such action and to maintain the stability of the region, he drafted his corollary. The U.S. would intervene in any Latin American country that manifested serious economic problems. The corollary also announced that the U.S. would act as the, quote, policeman of the Western Hemisphere. Although it was well-intended, it was a policy which eventually created a good bit of resentment in Latin America for the United States. And we could continue talking about Roosevelt's foreign policies that helped shape the world and the country for days, but we don't want to make this episode last too long. One of the last things I'll mention on his foreign affairs as a president was that he believed that a large and powerful navy was an essential component of a national defense because it served as a strong deterrent to America's enemies. During his tenure as president, he built the U.S. Navy into one of the largest in the world by convincing Congress to add battleships to the fleet and increasing its number of enlisted men. In 1907, he would propose sending the fleet out on a world tour. His reasons were more than one. He wanted to show off, quote, the Great White Fleet and impress other countries around the world with U.S. naval power, and to allow the Navy to gain experience of worldwide travel, as well as to drum up domestic support for his program. In December of 1907, a fleet of 16 battleships left the Hampton Roads, Virginia, and traveled around the world, returning home 14 months later in 1909. Among his domestic affairs, he took oath of office in September of 1901. He presided over a country that had changed significantly in recent decades. The population of the United States had almost doubled from 1870 to 1900 in just 30 years, as immigrants continued to pour into U.S. cities to work in the country's burgeoning factories. As the U.S. became increasingly urban and industrial, it began to gain attributes common to an industrial nation, such as overcrowded cities, poor working conditions, economic disparity, and the political dominance of big business. At the turn of the 20th century, Americans have begun to look for ways to address some of these problems, and as the chief executive, Roosevelt felt empowered by the people to help ensure social justice and economic opportunity through government regulation. He was not a radical, though. He believed that big business was a natural part of a maturing economy and therefore saw no reason to abolish it. He never suggested fundamentally altering American society or the economy to address various economic and social ills. He often stated that there must be reform in order to stave off socialism. If government did not act, the people would turn to more extreme measures to seek remedies. Roosevelt was perhaps one of the first presidents on record, or the loudest and largest proponent of the right of the people to rule the government. Not in a socialistic way, but he understood the careful and delicate balance that the people and government, the relationship between the two had. And who better to tell you his thoughts on this balance and the right of the people to rule than words from the man himself. This is an excerpt of a speech that he gave.
The great fundamental issue now before our people can be stated briefly. It is, are the American people fit to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves? I believe they are. My opponents do not. I believe in the right of the people to rule. I believe that the majority of the plain people of the United States will, day in and day out, make fewer mistakes in governing themselves than any smaller class or body of men, no matter what their training, will make in trying to govern them. I believe again that the American people are as a whole capable of self-control and of learning by their mistakes. Our opponents pay lip loyalty to this doctrine, but they show their real beliefs by the way in which they champion every device to make the nominal rule of the people a sham. Friends, our task as Americans is to strive for social and industrial justice achieved through the genuine rule of the people. This is our end, our purpose. The methods for achieving the end are merely expedients, to be finally accepted or rejected according as actual experience shows that they work well or ill. But in our hearts we must have this lofty purpose, and we must strive for it in all earnestness and sincerity, or our work will come to nothing. In order to succeed, we need leaders of inspired idealism, leaders to whom are granted great visions, who dream greatly and strive to make their dreams come true, who can kindle the people with the fire from their own burning souls. The leader, for the time being, whoever he may be, is but an instrument to be used until broken and then to be cast aside. And if he is worth his salt, he will care no more when he is broken than a soldier cares when he is sent where his life is forfeit, in order that the victory may be won. In the long fight for righteousness, the watchword for all of us is spend and be spent.
Spend and be spent. That was kind of one of his mantras. That's what people were here for, to spend their service for the government and to be spent. One of the largest central beliefs for his presidency was that the government had the right to regulate big business to protect the welfare of society, and he went after trusts and big businesses. Although Congress had passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, former presidents hadn't really used it very much. So when the Department of Justice filed a suit in early in 1902 against the Northern Securities Company, it sent shockwaves through the business community. The suit alarmed the business community, which had hoped that Roosevelt would follow precedent and maintain a hands-off approach. At issue was the claim, that the giant railroad company, the combination created by a syndicate of wealthy industrialists and financiers led by J.P. Morgan, violated the act because it was a monopoly. In 1904, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government and ordered the company dismantled. The High Court's action was a major victory for the administration and put business community on notice that although this was a Republican administration, it would not give business free rein to operate without regard for public welfare. And public welfare is kind of the name of the game for his presidency. I don't think there's a better way to say it. And he did a lot of stuff for the benefit of the people. A very famous story in his career is that he believed the government should use its resources to help achieve economic and social justice. When the country faced an anthracite coal shortage in the fall of 1902 because of a strike in Pennsylvania, the president thought he should intervene. As winter approached and heating shortages were imminent, he started to formulate ideas about how he could use executive office to play a role. Even though he did not have any official authority to negotiate an end to the strike, he called both the mine owners and representatives of the labor together at the White House. When management refused to negotiate, he hatched a plan to force the two sides to talk. Instead of sending federal troops to break the strike and force the miners back to work, he threatened to use the troops to seize the mine and run them as a federal operation. Faced with his plan, the owners and labor unions agreed to submit their cases to a commission and abide by its recommendations. He called the settlement of the coal strike a square deal, inferring that everyone gained fairly from the agreement. A term soon became synonymous with his domestic policies. The square deal worked to balance competing interests to create a fair deal for all sides: labor, management, consumer, business, developer, and conservationist. He recognized that his program was not perfectly neutral because the government needed to intervene more actively on behalf of the general public to ensure economic opportunity for all. Regardless, he was the first president to name his domestic programs, and it soon became a commonplace practice. Roosevelt was the nation's first conservationist president. Everywhere he went, he preached the need to preserve woodlands and mountain ranges as places of refuge and retreat. And remember, this is one of the things that characterizes him as well. As he spent time in the Badlands, and he identified the American character with the nation's wilderness regions. He believed that our Western and frontier heritage had shaped American values, behavior, and culture. He wanted the U.S. to change from exploiting natural resources to carefully managing them. He worked with Gifford Pinchot, head of Forestry Bureau, and Frederick Newell, the head of the Reclamation Service, to revolutionize this area of the U.S. government. In 1902, he signed the Newlands Reclamation Bill, which used money from federal land sales to build reservoirs and irrigation works to promote agriculture in the very dry western portion of the country. He won re-election in his own right in 1904, and he felt more empowered to make significant changes in this domain specifically. Working with Pinchot, he moved the Forest Service from the Department of the Interior to the Department of Agriculture, and it gave the Forest Service, as Pinchot as its head, more power to achieve its goals. Together, Roosevelt and Pinchot reduced the role of state and local government in the management of natural resources, a policy met with considerable resistance. Only the federal argument, they argued, had the resources to oversee these efforts. Roosevelt used his presidential authority to issue executive orders to create 150 new national forests, increasing the amount of protected land from 42 million acres to 172 million acres. He also created 5 national parks and 18 national monuments with 51 wildlife refuges. Wildlife refuges. And directly with the people, the emergence of a mass circulation independent press at the turn of the century changed the nature of print media in the United States. Instead of partisan publications that touted a party line, the media was becoming more independent and more likely to expose scandals and abuses. This era marked the beginning of the investigative journalism, and the reporters who led the effort were known as muckrakers. It was a term first used by Roosevelt in a 1906 speech. One of the best examples of his relationship with muckrakers came after he read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which described in lurid detail the filthy conditions in the meatpacking industry, where, if you haven't read that book, you should read that book. But, rats, putrid meat, poisoned rat bait were routinely ground up into sausages. Roosevelt responded by pushing for the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Both pieces of legislation endeared him to the public and to those corporations that favored government regulation as a means of achieving national consumer standards. He was the first president to use the power of media to appeal directly to the American people. He understood that his forceful personality, his rambunctious family, and his many opinions made good copy for the press. He also knew that the media was a good way for him to reach out to the people, bypassing political parties and political machines. He used the media as a bully pulpit to influence public opinion. When he left office in 1909, he felt assured that he was leaving the nation in able hands. His successor was his friend and former Secretary of War, William Howard Taft. Having enjoyed his travels in Europe and the Middle East with his family as a young boy, as well as his 2 years as a rancher in the Dakotas and countless hunting trips, it seems only logical that Roosevelt's next move would be embarking on an African safari. But after 2 years of collecting specimens, speaking engagements, and traveling, including as special ambassador to England for the funeral of King Edward VII, Roosevelt became disgruntled with Taft's weak enforcement of progressive policies and decided to make another run for the presidency. To do so, though, it meant launching a third-party initiative, as Taft was running on the Republican ticket already. Roosevelt formed the Progressive Party, which also became known as the Bull Moose Party, and began campaigning for the 1912 election. And in a feat of complete American badassery, while delivering a speech on the campaign trail in Milwaukee, Roosevelt was shot in the chest in an assassination attempt by John Nepomuk Schrank. Shockingly, he continued his speech for 90 minutes before seeing a doctor, later chalking up the incident to the hazards of business. He lost to Woodrow Wilson in that election in 1912 in a rather close popular vote. He considered running again in 1916, but bowed out in favor of Charles Evans Hughes, the Republican nominee. His political aspirations, however, would soon prove to be far from over. In 1914, when war broke out in Europe, Roosevelt became frustrated with Wilson's stance on neutrality, and continually criticized the president's policy. When the U.S. finally declared war, Roosevelt requested permission to head a volunteer division for service in France in World War I, but Wilson had the Secretary of War turn him down. He was proud that all 4 of his sons enlisted for service during World War I, but he became brokenhearted when his youngest son, Quentin, was shot and killed in Germany. And it was that he never really recovered from. It was like he ran through life without fear of his own well-being. I mean, he gave a speech for 90 minutes after he got shot and then just played it off like it was just, part of the job. And when he finally lost someone that was his own flesh and blood, and he had already lost his mother and his wife, but it was the death of his son that he never really recovered from, and he kind of retreated to a life of seclusion, and just dealt with that loss that he never really got over. When Teddy Roosevelt was a young boy, doctors discovered that he had a weak heart and asthma. They advised him to get a desk job and not to strain himself. But he lived a more active life than almost anyone to this day. Outside of his political career, he published more than 25 books about a range of subjects, including history, biology, geography, and philosophy. He published a biography and an autobiography, including The Winning of the West, which was comprised of 4 volumes. He died in his sleep on January 6, 1919, at his Long Island estate, Sagamore Hill, after suffering a coronary embolism. He was 60 years old and was buried at the Young's Memorial Cemetery in New York. His energetic vision helped bring the nation into a new century. America owes nearly 200 million acres of national forest and parkland to his foresight, among so much more that we owe him. And when you go to look and take in all that beautiful parkland that we owe Theodore Roosevelt, I can't think of a better place to start than Mount Rushmore, where his face is carved in the mountain in a display of American everlasting memorial.